Hello there. This is a different voice than you might have been expecting. My name is Daniel. I'm actually somebody who has been in keeping the commandments and living what you would call pronomian life pretty much my entire life. So I have kind of an unusual background, and I'm sort of taking over here, and I'm going to be putting R.L in the hot seat, as it were. I'm going to be asking him some questions. We're going to get to know a little bit more about your typical host here, and so really, really happy to be invited, and I think it's going to be really interesting. So, are you ready to get into this, R.L?
I think I am.
All right. So one thing I always like to know is, how do people come to pronomianism, right? Because it is against the grain of a lot of traditional Christian views and things like that. So was it like a specific moment? Was it a specific line of inquiry that got you here? Walk me through that a little bit.
Yeah, sure, Daniel. So for me, it was definitely more of a process than it was a moment. So I did grow up in the church as a child, but I did, I guess, properly become a Christian later in life, and sort of getting into sort of attending church, getting discipled. There was, I guess, some questions, sort of looking at, well, how does this bit relate to that bit? Occasionally asked the pastor a few times, and I didn't really think too much of it. I went just with the general mainstream perspective. But I began to see, I guess, the continuity from the old into the new when I started studying Matthew 5:17 to 20. I was doing a sermon series for our night service on the Sermon on the Mount. That was about 14 years ago. And so I guess before then it was just indifferent, not really overly interested. I'm still getting my head around sort of some other bigger theological issues at the time. But anyway, so after studying it, at that time I came to the conclusion that there's no way to get around. There is continuity between the old and the new. So Jesus didn't come to fulfill. Sorry, he did come to fulfill. It didn't come to abolish. Anyone who says don't worry about the least, you can just do, you can just ignore those the least in the kingdom. Yeah, there has to be some continuity. And so that was about 14 years ago. And at that stage, I wouldn't say I was, I guess, full pronomian at that point, but I think I was pretty much in line with what most general, I guess you could say, reformed people would promote. The sort of tripartite, the moral law, yep, that definitely has continuity. The other stuff, yeah, not too sure. So that was about that point. Roughly a little bit up. Yeah. Yeah, sorry, go on.
No, you're good. So you came from, you could say, maybe a more grounded place in terms, like, not that there's that many Christians that are true antinomian or anything like that. Most people at least believe you have some moral obligations of some sort or some, answer, but you could say you probably came from maybe a firmer place in terms of that. Than maybe typical. Is that what you're saying? And it was more of trying to classify what's still moral, and then you could maybe kind of landed on, well, I guess everything is moral or whatever, because there's really no like arbitrary laws kind of thing.
Yeah. So that was definitely, I guess, that launch point. So going from, I guess, the more general view, yes, there are moral laws, but we only get that from the New Testament. We don't worry about the Old Testament to get that. This sort of study on Matthew 5:17 to 20 was, okay, I can look at both, and I can get my morality from both. So that was the beginning. About that time, when I was at Bible college, I came across someone who was pretty much pronomian. They didn't use that title at all, but they would probably use that title for now. They sort of mentioned it, and it just blew my mind. Like, you what? Food laws? Feast? What? Blew my mind. So we had a really good long conversation. But why? But what about? I wasn't convinced in the conversation, but it definitely took down some barriers and sort of, I guess, opened me up to more inquiry, to more investigation from there. But it was, I guess, the really, I guess, grounding point, maybe early 2015, so a little bit over 10 years ago. I was emailed a bit of a lengthy message or sermon about the new covenant from Jeremiah 31. Never encountered that passage before, unpacked it, went through it, talking about, and I guess the two main points: the new covenant made with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, and write my laws on your heart. Totally changed my outlook on, well, no, I'm in the new covenant. Wait, what? Law on my heart? New covenant? Israel? Judah? Like, that totally opened my eyes to seeing that connection between, I guess, what I had, the old covenant people, and really broke down that obstacle of, well, no, that's for the Jews. Because I realized, well, hang on, if I belong to Christ, then I'm a legacy. I'm part of that continuing body of Israel, and that law that was given to them, well, that's been written on my heart as a new covenant member. So I guess you could say with that barrier down. So it's just that whole process of a brick here, big chunk here, big, occasionally big wrecking ball here, with that last one. The barrier down, I just began to dig into scripture, going back over those passages that I had used, and I've heard other people used to say, no, the ceremonial laws, all those things, just digging into them and thinking, okay, if I wanted to use this to argue against it, I'm going to parse it, I'm going to exegete it, I'm going to study the Greek phrasing and everything like that. And I realized they didn't hold water. They weren't that clear, obvious message that they sort of intended to communicate. And I guess that was the point that I became pronomian. And just over time, my study has just continually deepened and expanding my understanding of what being pronomian means. So yeah, that's my process.
That makes a lot of sense now. You were talking about those, the brick by brick and the wrecking ball and things like that. What do you think were some of the biggest objections, or maybe, the strongest arguments that you wrestled with the longest with some of these things? I do think some of the arguments you hear are fairly easily disregarded. It's just kind of, you went with it. You never really heard an alternate opinion. But there are some verses that are challenging. So, what were some of your bigger challenges, do you think?
In terms of previously held verses?
In terms of adopting it or kind of going with the traditional sort of thing. Or did you not really find that? Did you not find that, like, when you started to re-examine the text, just with the different framework, you weren't really running into much resistance?
Yeah, I didn't find any sort of, I guess, scriptural resistance. Yeah, so I guess externally, so from others, not a lot. I think I avoided that cage-staged. I don't know if you've ever heard the term the Torah terrorist.
Yep.
Yeah, I think I was never that. I guess I wanted to. I don't know whether it was a conscious choice or the Spirit's leading in that, but I really wanted to make sure that I was certain, so that when they asked the question, I could boom, boom, boom. Here's a passage, here's how I understand it. Try, hopefully not get caught out too much. I just wanted to make sure that I was certain and grounded before I even said anything. I think maybe the first mention I said to a good friend of mine, hey, we did Purim the other night, and it was a lot of fun. And that was probably the first sort of mention I got from that, and said, I think I'm open to looking at the feast. And beyond that, I wasn't very open about it. It was usually sort of only if it came up. Like, I wasn't out there saying, hey, check this out. This has changed my world. It's just, as the topic arose, I would occasionally maybe mention something. And I found that for the most part, and it's a very broad most part, pretty much everyone I talked to, they respectfully listened. I don't think I ever convinced them. But there wasn't really much pushback. Like, there wasn't like, what are you doing? You're crazy. Have you read Galatians? Like, there wasn't any of that sort of conversations. But I think there was, in part, and this is purely from my perception, there was a passive resistance. Sort of like, as I did become a little bit more sort of vocal, sort of, okay, I want to write some blogs and, just expressing, this aspect of pronomianism, this fact of the law. Hey, let's just rethink. It wasn't even the whole total, you're all wrong. This is the true path. Just, hey, here's some details. Let's rethink this sort of question. And I found that as I was sharing these, a lot of my peers from Bible college, I just sort of lost contact with them. They just stopped talking to me. Sort of, that's sort of more the passive response that I got. And I think it was more isolating than being sort of attacked or being called a heretic or anything like that. There was, I guess, a very small handful of people that I would say did sort of vocally push back. But again, it's like a minority. There's probably 4 instances that I can think of. So after that sermon I mentioned on Matthew 5, 17 to 20, after the sermon, someone came up to me and they sort of tried to challenge me. Hey, we're not under law, we're under grace, right? And I sort of pushed back a little bit and tried to engage in, healthy debate. Hey, here's this angle. What do you think of that? He just walked away. Wasn't interested in having a conversation about it. That was one instance. Someone from my old church, sort of from, back in 2016, I gave a sermon on the Sabbath. It's continuity, Seventh-day Sabbath. Here's my reasons for why I'm going that, why I think it's this way. And after I wrote a blog article, there's actually a 4-part series on the food laws back then. Guy from there, sort of respectfully, expressed his very strong disagreement. He described it as having a visceral response to my perspective. Still good friends. Consider him a dear brother in the Lord still. But just we disagree on that point. So it's that response. There was someone that I knew through Bible college. They were more like a tutor, like a guest speaker. Like they sort of come in occasionally to run things. Developed a good friendship with him. But he was very strongly opposed to any kind of continuity, and he was probably the more vocal of them all. He just sort of, the law and grace, they can't coexist. Like there is no way they could even be in the same room together. Actually, a conversation with him was my inspiration for Forgotten Covenant. Thinking about what are the obstacles in his mind. That's what inspired the book. And yeah, he was very much disagree with me, try to engage, no, close it off. And probably the 4th, when it comes to the food laws, I guess some family members thought it was just weird. Sort of kept asking, are you Jewish? Even I think some asked, are you turning Muslim or something like that? Just for a little while, but it is respectfully acknowledged. So that's, that's it. I think if there was any that I found sort of maybe a barrier, maybe a bit of an obstacle, I think I wasn't quite ready to embrace the food laws for quite a while, actually. I sort of resisted investigating it. So I've sort of looked at all these areas, but the food laws, no, I'm not ready to look at that yet. I don't know if it was because I wasn't ready to give it up, or maybe I thought, no, that's going to make me stand out too much. Like that's the final thing. If being pronomian was joining the military, the food laws is finally, shaving your head. Sort of that sort of, you're in now, that sort of process. So that's sort of some of my, I guess, sort of struggles and things I had there.
That makes sense. So so it seems like food laws was some of the you said some of the last lines of inquiry and whatnot. So what were some of the first kind of adjustments you were making as you were going on this? What are some of the first things you implemented as you started to walk with the law a little bit more?
Yeah. So I think probably Sabbath and feasts were probably the first ones that I sort of started going into. I think it was sort of maybe the easier options, and maybe it felt like the more obvious obvious thing. And I found that it just spending that time sort of each Sabbath, I'd sort of work a whole bunch of different things, walking through liturgies and Torah reading cycles and a whole bunch of different things. I found just really enriched and built up my personal worship time, and sort of that deepened and enriched my relationship with the Lord. But I think it's sort of for pronomians. I know for myself, probably a little bit the case, but I think sort of speaking to the pronomian audience, I think we need to be careful that I observe the Sabbath on the seventh day. That means my relationship with God is, it's going to be better than everyone else who meets on Sunday. Well, I don't think that's the case. I think there are many who don't, who wouldn't call themselves pronomian, who wouldn't sort of observe the Sabbath and the feast. They have a fantastic relationship with God. So it's not sort of saying that you need to have that to have a rich worship life. It's just, I think that's just my experience, sort of setting aside that time for me to do that. And with the feast, it really opened my eyes to the patterns in Scripture, that sort of topology and sort of the symbolism across between, I guess, the Old and New Testament, if you want to use that language, especially in the symbolism of the feast. It just really deepened, this is what Jesus did, this is what he accomplished, this is what it was about, this is just really deepened my understanding of those things. But yeah, like I've sort of fortunately realized pretty early on that, as if you call yourself a pronomian and you sort of live out those sort of, I guess, ceremonial aspects of the law, if you want to use that language again, you're going to stand out a bit. You're going to look a bit different. But again, I think pronomians and even people who are not, I think it's really important to remember that statistically speaking, we're not that odd. If you look at sort of lifestyle, because if you look at the usual practice, the usual lifestyle of most Christians, they're already keeping a lot of the law already anyway. We often hear sort of, can you imagine having to keep 613 laws? So hard, so terrible. Well, no one ever had to do that. No one ever had to do that. There was laws for Levites, laws for women, laws for Aaronic priests, laws for kings. It wasn't 613 for everyone. There was probably a few. But I found in Tyler Dawn Rosenquist, her book, The Bridge, she quotes someone who broke down all the laws and sort of the percentages of what laws are being kept at the moment. He worked out 58% of the law can't be kept anyway because there's no temple.
Mm-hmm.
So that's, over half. We wouldn't expect you to do that because there's no temple. You can't do those things. So it's 42% that's left. So 28% of the total are currently being kept, which is about 67% of the keepable laws already being done. There's probably 8% that are, I guess, impossible to keep for the culture. So that's punishments, that sort of judicial sort of level thing. Sort of, we can't do those things, restricted by law and things like that. And so when it came down to it, the pronomian is only keeping an extra 6% of the law compared to your typical Christian. So it felt sort of big, but sort of if you sort of work it out on paper, it wasn't like a real radical change from that perspective.
No, I mean, especially like I said, if you came from a pretty grounded, fairly pronomian perspective in the first place, because what can happen, I think it feels bigger sometimes when people come from a bit more of an ethereal place, like they go to a church that's a little more wishy-washy about morality and all of that, and
Oh,
kind of
yeah.
graying that line. But yeah, if you come from a more foundational, or whatever you want to say, confessional sort of faith, no, I mean, you're right. It wouldn't necessarily be as big of a deal, right? Because it's like
Yeah.
a lot of them, we have businesses here in the United States that aren't open on Sundays now, and things like that, because it's still a Sabbath. They move the day, but they are honoring the commandment in that way. And so that's a calendar issue more than just a principle issue, right? I mean,
Yeah.
there's more to it than that, but it's not quite as dramatic. When you say, well, Chick-fil-A is on Sunday and I'm on Saturday,
Yeah.
it doesn't seem quite so bizarre,
Yeah.
So yeah, I totally get that for sure.
Yeah. For you, I know sort of interviewing me, but I'm just really curious.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
For you, sort of growing up in a pronomian household,
yeah,
when you encountered, I guess, non-pronomian Christians, how was that encounter for you?
it's it's challenging, but I don't know if it was that much more challenging than anybody, because obviously the Christian term is so abstract, right? And so when somebody comes to you and they're like, I'm a Christian, in terms of how much of a shared worldview you have to really ask more exploratory questions. But what was interesting is I found that some of it would kind of work both directions. In one way, talking to more confessional types, we would have a lot more in common, because maybe we were taking the Bible a little bit more seriously, or at its textual value or whatever. Again, it's being a little less ethereal, a little less, I've checked the sinner's prayer and I'm good kind of thing.
Yep.
And and I'm not begrudging people for that, but it just makes it harder to have certain kind of conversations about things. Even if it's just like, I don't want to see that movie, it's a little bit inappropriate or something like that, and like, you're so legalistic or whatever, right? Which that's where I have in common, right? Because like even Reformed Baptists could get that kind of response, right? They get that. They get all the time. You look at like Paul Washer and stuff, and he's and all of that, right? And so, but the problem is those types often have a very firm faith, which is good, but it means that as soon as you enter into, oh well, or they find out it's like, oh, you're not going to eat pork or something, they're like, well, wait a minute, like what happened here? Like I thought we were on the same page, right? and you're right about the visceral response. For some people, I think they've just been really trained that it's like, that's Judaizing and that's a false gospel. Like they just go down that road really fast, and they're really worried that you're playing the earn the salvation card, which I find very tragic, because like I said, I feel like they get that card handed to them all the time. When they make a very strong statement condemning some moral behavior in society, they'll be like, well, what are you saying? That one thing is the proof that you're saved or something? And that's not what they're saying. But then they'll turn and they'll do it back. And I maybe just because they've heard that argument a lot, I don't know. But it's unfortunate when that happens, because then you're like, no, like let's take a step back, right? Like, we come from the same place where it's not we're looking at this list and it's like, well, if you don't believe this one thing, obviously I can segment you out or something. We're trying to be obedient, and you just think certain things are not a concern, and I do. Like, think of it more from the standpoint of people that might be worried about like the level of modesty in women's clothing, and people debate that and stuff. Like, let's have this conversation and not let's just jump to conclusions that I'm like trying to earn my way into heaven or something.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes, my neckline gets me into heaven.
Yeah, right. And I mean, there are some people that basically frame it that way, like independent Baptists sometimes get like that with the one true church, but like a lot of people aren't really having that conversation, right?
No.
They're just saying we can make society better while we walk through God, and this is with God, and this is all good, and all that. All right. So that being said, I know you're saying, it's not like some maybe major epiphany or something, like some people make it out, and that's great for them if that's the case, but it wasn't necessarily some major epiphany in that there was some big barrier between you and God that you broke down or something like that. But I am curious, do you feel, a change or a difference in the way you would look at things, with maybe just even taking the more congruity of the Bible? How do you think that kind of changed your views or your life or whatever?
Yeah. Yeah, sort of as you sort of alluded to, but not a lot. So as you sort of already summarized, sort of already coming from that good foundation. It was sort of just adding this small extra layer, but I think that
8%,
extra,
right?
yeah. But I think that has sort of opened me up and allowed me to sort of just, if anything, just that deeper appreciation, a deeper understanding of, I guess, obedience being an expression of love and gratitude. I think it's more deepened than anything. And it's also given me a deeper understanding of the role of the Torah, of the law, and my identity as a follower of Christ, as a covenant member of God. I think play that aspect, my understanding of the relationship between law and identity has played the biggest things. Because obedience to the law, was and is, it's a covenant identity marker. And I talk about this a little bit in Why Then the Law and Forgotten Covenant, but the commandments, in particular, the 10 commandments, they were actually more descriptive than they are prescriptive, if that sort of makes sense. It's sort of saying, in Exodus 19, if you obey my voice, you will be my people. It's not a case of, well, as soon as you tick all these boxes, I'll accept you as my people. No, it's not what it is saying at all, because when you read through Exodus, they're already his people. Let my people go. They haven't got to Sinai yet, so they haven't been given the list on how to become his people. It's, if you do these things, then you're living as my people. You are now functioning as a kingdom of priests. You are now functioning as my people, my treasure. This is what it looks like to live that way. So sort of understanding that, okay, I belong to Christ. Well, then, if that's the case, then this is how I need to live according to the law that God has prescribed. And even if getting to like the, I guess, a New Testament apostolic scripture perspective of Jesus in John 14, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. Well, that's just reiterating Deuteronomy 11. You shall therefore love the Lord your God and keep his charge, his statutes, his rules, and his commandments always. It's just as as the nation of Israel, you are to show your love for God, your creator, your redeemer, your savior, by obeying these laws. That's how you're going to show it. There's no change. It's, you hear it's a bit of a, I don't know if you want to call it a stereotype. It is a bit of a throwaway of, in the Old Testament, in the Old Covenant, you have to perform to belong. It's all about keeping the rules. But now it's all about love and, expressing. No, it's been like that the whole way through. So it's
yeah,
just how
no,
it's
I
always
mean,
been.
the thing I often will bring up with people with things like that is, it's like, you can easily say you show your love for your spouse through your faithfulness.
Mm-hmm.
However, that doesn't, and so when people act that way, they're obviously acting not out of love for their spouse, right? And it's a dance both directions. Like you said, it's both prescriptive and descriptive. You're both prescribing, hey, it's not a very good idea to do any actions that might cause you to do that.
Yeah.
Let's prescribe that. But it's also descriptive in that people who truly love their spouse wouldn't do it, right?
Yeah.
Right. I think why the 8% can be tricky is because I think a lot of the moral law that people follow seems more self-evident. I think where they get a little bit confused is something like the food law, because that doesn't feel like cheating on my spouse or something like that. It feels more arbitrary, and the Bible doesn't even fully explain the reason behind it, besides that it's distasteful or whatever, right? And so why we don't really is not really given. And so I think that's one reason why. And it's interesting that was kind of with the way you're thinking, that was the last domino to fall, in a sense, because it is kind of the odd one out, because I think everybody recognizes the moral value of a day off to reflect, take a break from your grind, get yourself out of yourself a little bit, because almost everybody does it, right? At least in some extent. Like, I don't know of almost any Christian group that's given up the idea of a weekly gathering or a weekly set apart time. And so, yeah, so most of them are pretty, and then holidays too are very self-evident, since most Christians also have holidays. They, it's so self-evident that you have to, like, Jehovah's Witnesses have to argue against them because it's just the default, right? So yeah, but it is interesting, like you said, you can end up where it would be like, in a sense, like your spouse being like holding you to it and you feeling obligated, but it's like, what person in a true loving marriage would be like, oh, I'm obligated to not cheat on my wife, right? Like, that's not how you think.
Oh, I have
right?
to. What a burden, right?
Yeah, right. What a burden to be monogamous and faithful, right? Like that. Yeah, exactly. So it is this dance that works together for sure. So, in terms of like the logistics and things like that, how much, does this affect kind of just normal week? This would be maybe more for people that are like newer to it, or are like, are kind of thinking that old way of, it's good. There's so much to pile on. I think sometimes when people do that, they're thinking of like Orthodox Judaism or something, and they think that what they're doing is actually like biblical, which even Orthodox Jews will say they're not. They'll say, we put in all these fences to prevent us from doing it. The rabbinical tradition, like, they know, like, you know what I mean? And yet people are like, oh, you have to do all those things. It's like, no, not to be strictly biblical, no.
Yeah.
So how much do you? I guess it really hasn't affected your daily life too much, but anything that kind of comes up, you think that makes it a little bit challenging or anything like that?
I think, if anything, keeping track of sort of the dates for the feast days and things like that. It's like, oh wait, what were you already? My year with my work just flies by. It's like, what? It's even like last week, during the last week of school. It's like, what? It's it's the end of term already. Like, what's going on? How do we get here? And so, keeping track of that takes a little bit of work. But I think what I find the hardest is probably my greatest challenge to Torah observance at the moment is Sabbath. Like, it's pretty simple and straightforward. Just, day of rest, honoring the Lord. And look, one of the beautiful things, the good things I like about the way it's sort of laid out in Scripture is it's not, you have to do all these things on the Sabbath. This is what it looks like. Again, you sort of mentioned the Jewish Orthodox and sort of all the different expressions there. They do all these things. They've got their liturgies, their rituals, their prayers, their ceremonies. I think if you want to incorporate them because, well, this is what they've been doing, I think there's some good stuff in there. So
sure.
I wouldn't say it's if you want to do Sabbath properly, you have to do these things. You have to, say the Shema 5 times in Hebrew, memorized, standing on your head, or anything like that. Or anything like that. But I think there's some value in there. But I think the biggest challenge I have with, I guess, remembering and honoring the Sabbath is, on the one hand, I'm still working out what that looks like because I haven't had it modeled.
Well, community-wise, right? You don't have a Sabbath community that's very solid, right? And so that's part of it. So that would make it difficult.
Yeah. So it is sort of challenging to do because, as you're saying just now, not having that community, because I'm not because I'm a workaholic. I am busy Monday to Friday, but because of that, because I'm busy Monday to Friday, there's things I need to do around the home. I need to spend time with my family. And as you said, my local church meets on Sunday. And so, and they're not a pronomian church. And so doing something as a family, whether that's like what I did today, going to a theme park, going to the movies, all those sort of fun family things, they just end up landing on a Saturday. And so I have to sort of, in order to have that time with family doing those things, it's difficult.
Yeah.
And I try sort of my best. And I know there's
No, I think you actually
pronomians who would say, no, you can't, you can't go spend money. I get the reasoning behind that. But
Right.
I think I need to balance fellowship with believers, spending time with my family. It's It does
No, I
sound like
mean, it might sound like a cop out to some people, but I honestly, this is my perspective on the Sabbath. It's sort of like the temple, right? The Sabbath, in my opinion, is made for the individual, but it's also made for the community. And I do believe that when you do not have a Sabbath community, it is very difficult to truly keep the Sabbath in the way it's intended. Because what you can end up having is, well, let's all just kind of sit home and stare at a wall kind of problem. I mean, not necessarily that dramatic, but it can become like that. And that's not, to me, what the Sabbath is about. I think sometimes people make it into something that's way too passive, which I guess by default they would think that way because it says, not to work. But it's customary work, and it is not an inactive thing. There are lots of things that you can try to prioritize in terms of family times, reconnection with your spouse, because you are not working. And I also agree with you too when you talk about children and you talk about time together and things like. I do think we can make it overly burdensome because one of the rabbit holes you can go down is not having other people work for you. But that's a difficult one because it's like, well, if you're running electricity or if you're going on in your car at all or if you're doing anything, and it is something you have to dance with, right? I feel like, especially when people are newer, they'll draw these very hard lines, and I do think we have to be protective of the Sabbath, but I think often they'll make it into something that isn't really sustainable. It's not going to work. It's like the people that go on like a fad diet and they just go completely crazy and they like cut everything, and then you're like, yeah, that's great for like a week, and yeah, you'll lose a lot of weight and you'll see the impact, but then you're not going to be able to keep that up because that doesn't actually integrate into your life well. So
yeah, definitely.
Not to try to give people a pass to do things, but I think you understand what I'm saying.
No, you're absolutely right, and sort of about knocking your past. There is that balance of, well, I could go, oh well, it's too hard. I just won't worry about it at all.
Yes.
But
again, if you think of just
what
even
I can where I can,
right, and even if you think of like, again, we'll even go to like the spouse cheating example. You could end up being kind of the blind Pharisee if it's like, well, every time I go to the grocery store, there's always a woman in a provocative outfit. And for a moment, I'm like tempted to think bad things. And so therefore, I'm never going to go to the grocery store, or I'm going to go to the grocery store blind. Like, you have to negotiate these things in the world, right?
Yeah,
so
exactly.
you have to figure this out, and that's not you giving yourself a license to lust, right? So like, I feel like there are ways you can balance that. So
that's a good analogy. I like that one.
Thank you. I've been doing this a little while, so.
Yes.
What was I going to say? I was going to say technology. Do you feel like the way that technology is now, do you think that it's helping people in pronomianism, as it were, or do you think it makes it more difficult? I'm curious your perspective on that. Kind of a different sort of question. But.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think it can be a bit double-edged. I think it's a blessing having, encountered pronomian community on the Discord channel with Josh, yourself, and David, and everyone else there. Such an encouragement to sort of persevere, place to sort of, bounce questions off, things like that. Really, really, really helpful on that aspect. I think where it sort of can become a bit sort of add a layer of difficulty is the online Torah terrorists who would, rip shreds off me because, I'm not disciplined enough with my Sabbath or things like that. And there's always room for debate, discussion, refinement, but I think it can sort of lead to that potential. But I think if anything, just having access, we being pronomian is a very huge minority,
Right.
especially here. I mean, I'm not sure what fellowship sizes are like there with pronomian churches, but at least you have something.
Yeah.
I think there are some around, but they're sort of very fringianic, if you wanted to use.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on how you define the term pronomian, right? So.
Yeah. So I think some can be a little bit out there. So, so not having that sort of in-person fellowship, and look, it's not a substitute for real fellowship, but it's what I have, and
Sure.
so I find it an encouragement. I'm not alone. I haven't come up with these crazy ideas all by myself.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Networking is huge, being able to do that. And also even something like this, right? I think one thing that's caused the resurgence of some of these things is technology. It's sort of similar to how people have talked about, alternate media in the political sphere raising conversation and kind of breaking up monopolies and things like that. I think it's a similar thing, right? When you have less centralized control over, which comes with the pros and cons, like you said. It also comes with the very out there, you could say problematic, the YouTube scholar, and all of that,
Yep.
which can go in really horrible directions as well.
Scholar.
Yeah, right. The YouTube scholar. Yeah, because it goes in multiple directions because there isn't a gate anymore, right? There's no gatekeeper, but that also means some ideas that I think were accurate and needed to go through are getting through now too, and so it works both ways.
Yeah.
Yeah, unfortunately, a lot of the time it seems like the weirder ones are the ones that win out. But I mean, I guess it was always thus,
they get
right?
the views.
Just always how it is, right?
Yeah.
So you are actually already, I had this on my list, but you already mentioned talking with other believers who did see the laws as applicable. So you could mention that, but it kind of goes with the next one I had, which is, what are common misconceptions that you hear about it, and like how do you clarify those? What are ones that you tend to, like the FAQ? What is the ones you tend to get a lot?
Yeah. We'll sort of briefly answer that first question there. So how do I handle disagreements? I think with anything, conversation's not a script, so it all depends on where they're coming from, what they've asked, what their background is, and things like that. So obviously just getting a gauge for, are they just antagonizing, or are they asking a genuine question because they're curious, or but I think I sort of tend to sort of lean on the side of grace and say, okay, I'm going to treat this as if they're genuinely curious and just sort of see how the conversation progresses. So I'll point them. So people say, what are you obeying the law for? I'll point them to, well, you're already doing this, you're already doing this, you're already doing this. So obviously you're not opposed to it that much. I will probably press them to say, well, show me where it says otherwise in scripture. So where does it say I can just forget it and ignore it? There's usually a good mix of passages. We're not under law, we're under grace. A bunch of passages from Galatians and things like that. And I'll walk them through this passage and I'll explain, well, actually, it's not actually teaching antinomianism. It's actually teaching this thing. And I guess the whole time I'm trying to, have empathy. I'm trying to be patient. I'm trying to show sort of grace there, because, I used to use those arguments too. I used to say the same thing, and I will explain that to them and say, I know exactly where you're coming from, because so many years ago, I would have said exactly the same thing. I would have taken to the exact same passages, but this is how I understand it now. And then I'll bring them to scripture. I'll say, well, let's have a look at Matthew 5:19, Romans 3:31, Jeremiah 33, 31, 33, Ezekiel 36, Romans 7. In my heart, I delight in the Lord. This is Paul. Postal Jesus, he's delighting in the law. And, Paul delights in the law. Do you delight in the law as well? And that's sort of where those disagreements will sort of go. How I sort of like to approach it.
Yeah, it makes sense. I think I'm reminded of, I don't know if you've ever heard of the Smarties test, but it's this psychological test where what they did was they would bring in a child and there would be a box of Smarties, and then they would say, open it up, and instead of the box of Smarties were pencils. And then they would take this kid out of the room, and then it would be a two-way mirror, and they would have the other kid look at that, and the kid would walk in, and they would say, what do you think that kid thinks is in the box? And the kid would say, pencils, even though they're like, well, what did you think was in the box? Well, I thought it was Smarties, right? And so it's basically, the concept is you forget not knowing something. And I think sometimes they'll have that aha moment and the congruity and all of that, and they'll forget when they didn't see the Bible that way, right? And then it becomes that the people that are arguing against it are literally like not believing the Bible or something. Like it's hard for them to see that reality. Like, because we do get over that as human beings. Like we figure out that, like, a kid just doesn't even understand that idea. They just, once they learn something, they forget not knowing ideas. It. Yeah. But adults do know that somewhat, because they've like proven also, like, people that know how to use smartphones will way underestimate how long it took them to learn it, and they'll get very impatient with somebody new learning it and things like that. I mean, we see this modeled all the time, and so I'm not saying you're like that. I'm saying you are counter that, and that's good because that's an easy trap to fall into.
Absolutely.
Sure. Yeah. So
yes.
that's where you have to have that grace, right? And
absolutely. I think that's with any theological conversation.
Sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Your second question about misconceptions.
Yes.
I do hear a number of them. Personally, online, things like that. You're trying to be Jewish. You're trying to earn your salvation, as one you said before. Oh, you're Judaizing. You're denying the gospel. You're denying the work of Jesus. I don't think I can just respond to one, but I will respond to two. I think probably more common ones, and I don't know, maybe they'll sort of overlap the others. So I guess, and I just sort of, I think I alluded to this in an earlier question, that by obeying the law, and this is the law revealed in Torah, in the Pentateuch, it's not you're not trying to be Jewish. These are laws that were given to God's covenant community. You're my people. Right. These are my laws for you. Right. And it was, these are your covenant boundary markers. They're not ethnic boundary markers. And often we hear them describe, these are the ethnic boundary markers that the Jews by their bloodline were setting apart from the Gentiles who are of different bloodline. It's actually not. These laws are actually tied up in God's identity, in his holiness, his righteousness, and so they're not a cultural phenomenon. They're not, we're Jewish, we're going to do these laws. It's God, I am God. These are my laws. This is who I am. And he's the God of the Jews and the Gentiles. He's not a Jewish God. And so that's why the laws are not ethnically limited. Because that's why a Gentile could be part of the covenant community in the time of Moses. And they would call themselves an Israelite, even though they were not bloodline descended from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And it would be expected that they obey the law. You're a stranger, you're not a native born, but these are the laws that you have to do anyway. And that's the moral aspects, the ceremonial aspects, the judicial aspects. They were all expected to, participate in these things. And that's why I love in Isaiah 56, it says, "Let not the foreigner who has joined himself to the Lord say, the Lord will surely separate me from his people." So Isaiah, Old Testament, under the Mosaic covenant, there wasn't a Jew-Gentile division in God's covenant community. He goes on, and the foreigners who join themselves to the Lord to minister to him, to love the name of the Lord and to be his servants, everyone who keeps the Sabbath, what? Gentiles, foreigners keeping the Sabbath, and does not profane it, and hold fast to my covenant. These will I bring to my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer, their burnt offerings and their sacrifices. Gentiles offering sacrifices, participating in the ceremonial law. For my house will be called a house of prayer for the Jews, no, for all peoples. And yes, sure, in the time of, from Moses to the return of the exile, yes, majority of people in Israel who identified as Israel were ethnically Jewish, but not exclusively. So it's not trying to be Jewish. The laws aren't Jewish. They're God's laws. God's not a Jew,
Right.
And so it's just, I'm not trying to be Jewish. I'm just trying to be obedient.
Yeah, no, and it's interesting when you're talking about Gentiles as sacrifices. I think sometimes, because of the way the text is constructed and just our biases and stuff, we forget that a lot of human history happened before Moses, and you have like Cain and Abel giving sacrifices, and that was pre-Mosaic law. And so, like there's a congruity of some of these practices. Obviously, we don't have much information about ritual prior to Moses, really, but we have some, and the some we have is in harmony with what we see later. And so, again, you see a consistency. So it's always the question of, well, what makes us the special generation that isn't worrying about this or something like that. And I also really agree with what you said about the character. That's where the description of the law makes a lot of sense, right? It's a prescription to us, but it's a description of God's character. Everybody knows that it says moral truths, but again, they'll take that kind of separation in terms of like, well, these are moral and these aren't, and all of that, and kind of muddies the waters for sure.
Yeah. And I guess so the second objection is, being obedient doesn't deny the gospel at all. When you read through the epistles, whether it's Paul, James, Peter, none of them deny the place of obedience for the outworking and expression of salvation. Paul in Romans 3, do we then overthrow the law by this faith? By no means. On the contrary, we uphold the law. Ephesians 2:10, we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, that we should walk in them. James 2:20, faith without works is useless. 1 Peter 1, to those who are the elect exiles in the dispersion, according to the foreknowledge in the sanctification of the Spirit, for obedience to Jesus Christ and the sprinkling of his blood. And I mentioned before in Jeremiah 31, where it says, I will put my law within. Like, that's a new covenant reality. I will put my law in them. And this is in the context of, the Mosaic covenant, the law that was given there. I'll write it on their hearts. Ezekiel 36, I'll give you a new heart and a new spirit I'll put within you. I'll remove your heart of stone, give you a heart of flesh, and I'll put my spirit within you and cause you to walk in my statutes and be careful to obey my rules. And so the promise of the gospel is you get a renewed heart, and that renewed heart is going to delight in the law. It's going to submit to the law. You could almost say the new covenant empowers what sort of was envisaged with the old covenant, if you want to use that language. And so it's just, and I think it's more than just moving us to want to.
Yeah, I mean, and when you're talking about the whole, like, the way that people say you're denying God or whatever, the sacrifice or whatever, the atonement, the thing is that, like I said, this is the same argument that a lot of people get already. When they come out about certain behaviors that are countercultural or whatever, they'll start to get these sort of, well, you're legalistic or whatever. And I think that's where it can kind of help people like us that are taking the minority view about the list of some of the things. We have a disagreement on some of the concerns you would have about obedience, but I think a lot of the arguments you get are really antinomian arguments that don't hold a lot of water, and most people don't really believe them unless they're truly antinomian, which of course there are some people that disruptive or whatever, hedonistic or whatever it is. But most of the time that's not the case. They don't like the fact they add, that's in their list. And so it's like, okay, but that's not what we're arguing. We're not arguing whether or not anybody should have a list. We're arguing what the list is.
Exactly.
Because everybody thinks there should be a list of identifying markers. Otherwise, what's the point of even being Christian in terms of like, how would you be distinctive from anybody else in the world? You wouldn't be showing any defining characteristics. So.
Exactly right. Yeah, and like even with, denying the gospel, like most will say, okay, yeah, fair enough. Moral law kind of makes sense. But even when you get into ceremonial law, again, using sort of more common terms, I know there's issues with those sort of labels, but, when you look at the ceremonial law and the gospel, like, okay, here's a shadow. It has historical relevance, but today, it's practically irrelevant. Well, when you look at the festivals, like they all pointed back and they all pointed forward as well. Whether that's Passover, or anything. With Passover, it was celebrated in Israel to remember what Yahweh did in delivering them from Israel. But it was done the night before their release. The substance came, but it continued to be celebrated in remembrance of what happened. But it also pointed to Jesus, delivering us from slavery and dying as the Passover lamb for us. But we still await a final and full deliverance. So we remember the gospel in the Passover meal, that what was accomplished, what was achieved, and what are we still waiting for? And so it's, if you think about it, it's a little bit inconsistent because,
especially since they have holidays, they understand the premise of having commemorative events to remind you of things.
Yeah,
and there is no Christian holiday about the future. But there is you really can make the Festival of Trumpets about the future when you look at the symbols of trumpets in the wake-up call and Revelation and the return of Jesus. There is no Christian holiday like that's generally celebrated. That's about what hasn't happened yet.
Yeah. So the looking back and looking forward aspect there, I think that's in nearly all the feasts, Passover, we're waiting for our final deliverance. We're waiting for the final harvest of unbelievers. We're waiting for our eternal rest with our Creator in tabernacles. So many things. But where I was sort of going with it's a bit inconsistent to say, well, that was a shadow. It's been fulfilled, and so if you are trying to keep Passover, the feast, the Sabbath, you're denying what Jesus did. Well, communion was given as a
there's Easter, right? It's just remembering what happened, right?
Communion was given as a foreshadow of what Jesus was going to do the next day.
Sure.
Very much like Passover. And that was given to Jews. And the substance came the next day. Okay, here's the foreshadow. The substance came. Yet they keep doing communion, but the substance has come. Why do we keep doing it? Because we look back and we look forward to his return. And that's the same with the feasts and things like that. And so I think observing it, whether that's any of the law, to say it sort of denies the work of Christ, ignores that Jesus fulfilled it. He gave it its fullest meaning. Now it's richer. Now it's much more meaningful. Like, we now have a bigger reason to follow, bigger reason to observe. I mean, yes, the Passover, Passover's coming up, so sort of it's on my mind at the moment. But
sure,
when they celebrated Passover, we were delivered from Egypt. Fantastic! It's pointing to Christ. That has happened. What bigger reason do we need to celebrate Passover?
No, and I mean it's traditional within Judaism that the idea is that we should all feel like we've been let out of Egypt. It's part of their ritualistic seder. If you buy like a Haggadah, it's in there. And how much more so in a way can we say that, right? Because there's a personal relationship with God that transcends Judaism in terms of the veil being torn and all of that. We can speak to being delivered from Egypt in such a direct, personal way, and take that upon ourselves. So how much more rich and how much more would we want to celebrate it as well? Like, it makes a lot of sense. And I mean, again, it's just natural. Like, the shadow argument is so weird to me, because it's like saying, well, because I have my wife, I shouldn't want to celebrate my anniversary because she's here. And it's like, that doesn't really make a lot of sense. You do things so you can remember stuff, and everybody knows this. This is why they keep Christmas and Easter, right? So it is a bit of a that's a poor argument to me, and that one doesn't really hold up very well.
Yeah. So it's not denying the gospel. I think it's celebrating the gospel.
Absolutely. I mean, that's exactly what it is, right? It is the gospel, right? The holidays are a wonderful picture of the plan of salvation. So
absolutely, yeah. But I think probably the biggest way that the obeying the law is in line with the gospel is that within the promise of the gospel is that we can obey with right motives and a right heart. We're going to do it from the right place. In the moral law, honoring God as holy and glorifying God to the nations, that was the original purpose. And so we sort of do that as a witness, and that's going to be our motive. Okay, I'm not obeying to be saved. I'm obeying because I am saved, and I want people to know this is what God is like. And so you expressing that through how you live, and that's probably more so with the moral law. But ceremonial law can do that as well. But yeah, when it comes to this ceremonial law, when you get to passages like Amos 5, where God says, "I hate your festivals," and some people say, "See, God hates festivals, so why are you doing it? Why are you observing feast days? God hates them." But the issue God had was hypocrisy. The two biggest commandments, which actually come from the Old Testament, they should be behind our worship. Love God and love neighbor. Like, that should be what's happening behind the scenes. But for Amos's audience, that wasn't happening. They weren't obeying those things. There was injustice, idolatry, greed, sexual immorality, and they were just coming to the festivals. They were coming to Sabbath services, whatever they looked like, as if nothing had happened. Maybe they were hoping, I rocked up and did this thing that'll sort of atone for my sin. But that's, they didn't have the Spirit working within them. But for us, if we belong to the new covenant, then the Spirit is in us, and it's moving us to obedience in those areas. It's making sure, are you observing my Sabbaths? Are you, eating these foods? Are you living a morally righteous life for these reasons, to honor God and to love your neighbor? And so it'll move us to repentance before worshiping God. And I think when it comes to Amos 5, it can be, I don't know if I want to call it it's maybe not as strong as a warning, but maybe probably a reminder to pronomians that eating kosher, observing feast days, keeping Sabbath, if we're doing those things, but we're neglecting these more important matters of Torah, we're not keeping Torah. We're not walking in obedience. We're just like Amos's audience. Okay, cool. You changed your diet. Maybe you change the day you gather with other believers, but you still got all this other stuff going on. And I think God would say, I hate your meal plans. I hate,
Yeah. Well, people talk about it in Sunday churches too. The people, they come on church on Sunday, and then who knows how they are the rest of the week, right? But they go every week because it kind of checks something off the list, and they're like, okay, I've made things right. And it's like, that's not really how it works.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah. And so I think if, the Spirit's working in us, it's going to move us to love the Lord and we're going to serve Him with gratitude, fulfilling the greatest commandment. But what I love is that we're not going to do this perfectly. We're not always going to love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength as we come to our weekly. We're probably scraping ourselves out of bed because we're dog tired. we don't feel like serving our neighbor, we're not going to do it perfectly. But the good news of the gospel is that Jesus makes up that deficit.
Yeah.
He did the parts that we didn't do, and again, people can use it as a cop out. Oh, Jesus did it, so I'll do this
Right.
little thing and it'll be fine. I think it's meant to be an encouragement of I'm going to try my best. Jesus makes up that deficit, so and it's like God sees us as though we're doing it perfectly.
Yes.
God looks at how I'm very imperfectly trying to do this Sabbath thing, and He's going to be pleased, hopefully, with it because of Jesus in my place. He's imputed righteousness to me, and our heart's desire should be that pursue it as much as we can, but be encouraged that because of Jesus, because of the gospel, despite our imperfections, it's going to be accepted. Obviously, if there's unconfessed, high-handed rebellion, I'm going to do whatever I want, and okay, no, I'm covered by Jesus. No, you're walking into Amos 5 territory there. But I think if we're seeking to love the Lord our God and our neighbor, coming to worship to celebrate with that heart, I think our best will be considered as Jesus' best, sort of in our place. And so to say that trying to obey the law, or the law, as much as possible, is, I think is a bigger fulfillment of the gospel than pushing some things aside because they look a little Jewish.
Sure. I mean, yeah, right. Yeah, absolutely. All right. So I think we may be coming up on time here, are we?
Yes. Yep.
All right. So I guess to kind of close this up, I'll throw it back on you if there's anything, since I'm here. Is there anything that you would be interested in asking me specifically that's kind of maybe risen from this conversation, or I don't know, just on top of mind, or maybe passive related or something? I know I'm putting you on the spot here.
How much, like, your as you gather to celebrate Passover with your family and community, how much is your Seder, your liturgy, if you will, how much of that is I don't know if you want to say custom made, or how much of it is from Jewish traditions? Like how
traditional?
Did you...
Yeah, it's actually interesting you ask that question. So I do actually come from a ethnic Jewish heritage. My dad was raised Orthodox Jew, so it's a little bit. It has a little bit of a different articulation for us than I think it would for a lot of people, because it's not connecting to like our spiritual ancestry or whatever you want to say, church roots kind of thing. It's ethnic as well, right? But I will say, for the most part, when we're celebrating the holidays, they are not all that Jewish at all. Like, we don't tend to use a lot of Hebrew. We don't tend to do that many things that are necessarily traditional. It depends, because a lot of the traditional stuff just comes from a natural outgrowth of what would make sense when you celebrate a holiday, right? But when it comes to Passover, I would say it's probably the closest we do to something fairly traditional. Now, that being said, we've modified it quite a bit, because the traditional is very dense, and so it to me it becomes so ceremonial that, especially with kids and things like that, I don't find it as celebratory as I would like. But we do a lot of the traditional songs and things like that, and we do like the Seder played and the a lot of the steps and things like that. But we also have our own spin. We read from the New Testament. We have some songs in English that, like, we have a Psalm 114 that's in English that was written by, as far as I know, a Christian in Alaska named Stephen Pearson. It's a nice rendition. And so it's a little bit of a hodgepodge. But like the other holiday celebrations connected to the season, the first day and the seventh day of unleavened bread, are just scriptural liturgy. So we will have commonality with them, just like we would with anybody who's trying to find thematic passages, but there's really nothing about either of those that's all that specifically Jewish per se.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
if that
Yeah,
makes sense.
yeah, no, it does. Yeah,
And yeah, I mean, there's lots of different ways to do it. I mean, and you see this also again in normal, whatever you want to say, in standard Christendom or whatever, about like Easter and Christmas and stuff, and people's tolerance of certain things. Some people take it very somber. Some people are more decadent, and you know, you have to find what makes sense to you and what you think edifies the day. In my opinion, you know, within scriptural reason, of course.
Yeah, no, that's definitely a point. Yeah, so we're pretty similar. So again, sort of the feast days was one of the first few things I sort of picked up, and Passover was one of them. And like, cool, all right, Passover. How do we do that? So it was fine, and I found a Haggadah, and it was quite depth and detail. Looking through it, thinking I've got 2 kids under 4. Nope. So just
Right,
looking at
yeah.
what's the bare what's the bare minimum we can do that honors the day, brings in sort of enough meaning. How can I connect this to Christ? How can I point out as a fulfillment so that it is a joyful time, not a not a time of discipline and wrath?
Yeah. One thing I really like about the
kids.
Jewish tradition that I've incorporated that I think is the idea of making your children inquisitive. Like you try to do unusual things so that they ask questions, and I think that's a very good teaching. And one thing that I would say that Christians sometimes rub against, particularly depending on your background, is this idea of ritual, because they can be very anti-ritual in a way that I don't think is beneficial. Like I think there was something lost when they didn't do as many catechisms and things like that. I think there's something to be said about grounding, and we're starting to see a return to that, by the way, because people are understanding you need a solid footing in culture, right? And so it's making that conversation a little bit less difficult. But anyway, yeah. But I mean, teaching your children in a stricter way where there's like almost a script and all of this can feel very foreign, especially if you're from like a non-denominational or like a Southern Baptist or something. But
Yeah.
I do see a value in it, and I think that that's something where I'm not sure culturally if they made the right choices along the way on that one.
Yeah.
So. But yeah, to your point though, make it fun. You know, it's supposed to be joyous, and again, we're back to sustainability, right? My brother, I'm not sure in terms of his religious perspective where he's at entirely, but I do know that he continues to keep the holidays, and because he grew up with them and they meant something to him. And we see this with, again, Christmas and Easter and things like that, right? And there is a value to it. People can say whatever, there's no Christ in their Christmas and stuff, but regardless, I feel like there's at least a shadow left, there's a remnant left, there's a door to have a conversation. I think that these things do help when you have these trickle down effects of these celebrations. So
yeah, and it's, you know, the Passover, the elements and the details is such a rich way to communicate the gospel, the elements of
course,
crucifixion, and you know that's not to deride Easter traditions, but you know, a chocolate egg, a hot cross bun, you know, maybe a special communion service. Like, yeah, there's meaning in it. You know, you can still get something meaningful across. But from what I've sort of gathered, like even for myself, like it's richer with, you know, with the elements of a Passover meal. Like you're getting more. I feel anyway, at least.
I agree, and I think that's partly because it's a little more anchored. You know, it's been a little bit less disrupted and things like that. I've always been curious if I went to like Israel, which of course is a lot more secular, how I would kind of interact with the holidays there and feel about it, because I'm sure there you get some more of the, whatever you want to say, diluting and the kind of weird, well, how does this really tie into the meaning of the event day? But I don't know. I haven't actually lived there to experience it, but I would be curious to know, when you have more people doing it, what eventually would happen, you know?
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'm certainly looking forward to Passover. I'm sure you are, and I'm sure I'm not sure when this is going to go out, but either you have experienced it or whatever. And I wish you a great Passover. And thank you so much for having me on. It's been a delightful conversation.
Pleasure. No, it's great. Great. Thank you, Daniel. Really appreciate your time and this experimental takeover episode. I think it's worked reasonably well.
All right, sounds good. All right, so I guess we will see you all around, right?
Yep.